women who are very successful are some of the ones who started very successful industries, including the flower industry, because they were smart. They just made a sensible choice that was consistent between the domestic and extra-domestic roles. But the point of this story, other than it's interesting, today, women, aim for the sky. At that time, they didn't even expect there would be appointed PSs. The point of the story is, I wrote up that paper for the NGO Forum in '85. And one way or the other, it found its way to President Moi. And he wakes up one morning and decides, I'm going to break the glass ceiling, because we talked about the glass ceiling. And therefore, one day we are sitting there, and we get announced he appoints 7 women to break the glass ceiling. I happen to be one of them. Wow. So the point of the story is, how do we make sure that research links to policy in real time? I'm seeing very good pieces of research done, but nobody seems to know about them. And yet, sitting in government as I'm doing now, I see a lot of questions that worry me. And for example, devolution, I'm waiting to see a good piece of research on devolution that is independent, that's analytical, that's objective, where I see a major disconnect between where the shoe is biting in terms of issues and what research we are doing. And that, again, is something that has struck me as requiring to be recalibrated, because the reason many of the women in this room made so much difference in the past is that small acts, small interventions were very quickly able to translate into policy change. So the question then is, in the past, a key element of success was strong women leadership, which combined policy engagement at the highest level. That's how FAWE was born. The idea was you get a group of women researchers in education, and but they need to be either ministers of education or heads of academic institutions, so that they are able to engage at the highest political level, and you bring the two together. I don't know the extent to which Kodu we have maintained that vision. I have not, but that was the idea, because research on its own is just data. But research turned into policy is transformative, and we need to rebuild that connection that we seem to have weakened a little bit. And I'm saying, for reasons that are not clear to me, and it's possible perhaps I've not, I'm wrong here. I feel like we have lost the momentum just as we were about to reach the threshold. Strong women's network that nurtured young talent and provided strong advocacy appear to have lost steam. In spite of a wide range of support programs for women by both government and the development partners, the sum seems to be much, much less than the parts. So I'm asking, what went wrong? Did the slowdown of the economy in the 1990s and early 2000 lock women out of the economic activity? The example that comes to mind is what UNAIDS has done with the HIV agenda. Every year they publish their flagship report on the state of HIV/AIDS. It's been a fantastic experience for steering policy and action in the same direction. And much of the gains we have made on the HIV fight has been partly because there has been a very sharp focus from the UNAIDS report. There are not many times that you have research that has such a direct bearing on policy and action. And I'm urging us to begin to think back, to come back to that. Then an important issue that cuts across all this is education quality. John Mogo is here. I've been following your work with WESO and the scary data that you keep producing. I keep hoping it will improve. But when a kid is in grade 6 and they cannot read a grade 2 text, something is scary. It means we have are education facades, not education institutions. And if they don't get it right at the foundations, it means that secondary education is doing the work of primary education. Universities are doing the work of secondary and sometimes primary education. Other than the wasted effort and wasted resources, how can we compete with the rest of the world, the rest of the continent, when we can't even read, so to speak? So education quality is absolutely key. In a report that we did some time back, I know you remember this, it's one of the things I was proud of. We looked at education quality and we brought some of the people who had done some work on this. And the overall conclusion was that it is the test scores that are larger. How can we compete with the rest of the world, the rest of the continent, when we can't even read, so to speak? So education quality is absolutely key. In a report that we did some time back, I know you remember this, it's one of the things I was proud of. We looked at education quality and we brought some of the people who had done some work on this. And the overall conclusion was that it is the test scores that are larger, than one SD that make the difference. It's the quality. Somebody said it's the economic stupid. It's the quality stupid, so to speak. It's not the number of years. It's not the amount of money that you are putting into education. It's the learning outcomes. And that is absolutely critical. This is from the OECD countries. And you see that increasingly, this is quality now measured in terms of the course programs. Those who are doing science and mathematics are in high demand in the labor market, whereas those who have not got the STEM courses, you can see the flat line. They are in less demand, and that's happening across the board. It is both the skills themselves in terms of science, math, as well as the quality of those skills. UNESCO set up a learning metric task force about 2 years ago, and they did a report. And the essence of the report is that there needs to be a global shift in focus and investment from universal access to access plus learning. Just getting kids into school is, in a sense, a waste of everybody's time, including a waste of time of the children, and that's partly why we have such high dropouts. So improving quality cannot be overemphasized. So the question then is, what can a group such as WERK do in order to nudge the learning quality in our schools? Anna mentioned earlier about some of the work we used to do in exams council. All we will do is, after CPE is done, they did the composition, we'd analyze it, and then see how are the kids performing. And the variation was absolutely amazing. You would find some children, about 10%, who all they could do was write the question over and over again for the entire half an hour. At the end of the continuum, you would get maybe another 10% who would write a composition that would be so good. It would be better than what the teachers would write. And then you had everything in between. So who would visit the schools that had done very, very poorly and try to would actually visit them physically, find out what's happening. What was interesting was very simple. The schools where kids could not do more than write their name, even before you go in, the fences are not cut. There is a lot of noise even before you come in. You don't need to be told that there's something very wrong in that atmosphere. And we would announce these results, and in half of the cases, the headmaster would be fired the following year. So it had a direct effect. On the other hand, and these were not private schools, those that had top-notch students, you go in, there is discipline. The kids are learning whether there is a teacher in the classroom or not. And the question is, how do you make sure that that becomes the norm and not the exception? Because that's what we aspire towards, as parents, as teachers, as government, and so on. So education quality is an issue that needs to come back squarely on the agenda. I saw a colleague from Ministry of Education. I don't mind how many years we do, whether we do 8, 4, 4, 8, whatever, but we've got to look at what are the learning outcomes, because they are very poor, and that has been exacerbated by the shortcuts that we creatively take as Kenyans in exams. Thirdly, we need better data that speaks to today's issues, some of which are outlined above. We need data on learning outcomes, what works, and how to scale it. The learning metrics basically introduce two new dimensions to learning outcomes, not just cognitive skills, but also non-routine, higher order cognitive skills, ability to understand complex ideas, deal with complex information processing, and so on and so forth. And then also non-routine interpersonal skills, people who can work collaboratively to solve a problem. And again, as we review our curriculum, these need to be front and center, because 21st century skills require a whole person, which is essentially the message of the learning matrix task force. Finally, strong and strategic coordination is essential to share ideas and experiences and harness resources. So 2015, as I said earlier, was declared the year of women's empowerment and development towards Africa Agenda 2063. What did we get out of it as Kenya? Maybe I missed it. A full year of women's empowerment and development. It is a serious agenda. It is on the African Union agenda. A lot of effort has been spent on it. But other than the individuals who are working on this, we still don't seem to have an effective mechanism of moving that from Addis Ababa, AU, to a room like this and several rooms like that. That's the kind of coordination I'm talking about. Second, when you look at all development partners without exception, they have a very specific and clear gender agenda. USAID summarizes it for everybody, so to speak. The agency will measure performance in closing key gender gaps and empowering women and girls, learn from successes and failures, and disseminate best practices on gender integration. Great. DFID, I'm sure, has something very similar. You have, I know you do. But is it translating into everything you are doing? Some of you have been funded by these agencies. To what extent is there alignment between what you are doing under their funding and that objective? To what extent are we able as researchers to influence how you translate that statement, which makes a lot of sense, but translate it into something that's meaningful to what you and I do? So better coordination will enable Kenyan women tap into these resources more effectively. And the private sector is doing the same. KEMSA has a whole gender theme. Ernst & Young has an entrepreneurship program for women entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth. The catalog is very long, and we have Uwezo in government for women and youth, lots of programs, affirmative action and funded programs in government. But when you add them all up, they don't seem to be producing the oomph. They don't seem to be taking us to the expected level. What is missing? So in closing, what I would like to say is that it is fitting that we use this Walking Memorial Lecture to rededicate and rebuild the momentum on the gender agenda. We have successfully overcome 19th century constraints that kept women and girls behind. We need to regroup to overcome 21st century constraints and enable the women take a commanding lead in corporate boards, politics, including as governors, academia, and business leaders. Thank you.
On what should be the charge? It's a man who proposed. It was seconded by another man. The third man came to wrap it up. And the women were asked if they were of any opinion, and they were all quiet. And so the decision was ratified, and right outside the meeting, they were all complaining. So I don't know this forum where we sit here, What are the deliberate, practical steps that we really need to make to ensure that the women at the grassroots, my mother in Lugari, in Chakalini, 76 years of age, she can effectively hold my MCA, Mr. Titus Kwoma Maraj, accountable to the use of public resources at that level. Thank you.
It's a comment. I've been looking a lot on inequalities. And I think the more inequalities there are in a society, the more inequality, gender inequality you experience. And as much as we have got girls in school, there's a big issue that is emerging in the sense that, I don't know if you remember, if we talk about the 70s and the 80s, when I look back, I always tell people when I was in the Ministry of Education, even the PS took their children in public schools. Yours went to public schools. I taught Mrs. Gashukia's, Dr. Gashukia's daughter. And now we have got our schools and their schools. And my worry is, even the curriculum reform, do we feel part of that reform, or we are reforming a curriculum for their children? And I think as you came back and looking for networks, you found also we have progressed in having so-called non-formal schools, local schools, and unfortunately, it is the girls that are more in those schools. And these are issues, we are doing that research, I think, at WERK, but those issues are not coming out. We are saying we are making progress, girls are in school, but what quality of education and school are we having for the girls? They may be in school, but actually they are getting a raw deal. And I think as women, as Kenyans who want equality, we need to look at that issue of our school or our children's school and their school.
Coming up with a research agenda, so the 60 or 70 people graduating maybe come up with data that can help government in policy. But my question is, since you're in government, does the government have a research agenda? Because I think it is the government who should tell us this policy, this agenda we have. And then now, because what happens in the university is that everybody is trying to get an objective and finish their thesis. The universities could come up with their own agenda, but then still it will be disjointed. Because University of Nairobi have their own agenda, KU their own agenda. I think it's the government to come up with a research policy and say, the next 5 years, we need data on girl child or on this, and then now challenge the university to come up with that data. So my question is, Dr. Kanyia, since you are advising us, does the government have a policy, this is in the next 5 years, 10 years, and then we can pick that up and work on it?
The issue about the elite opting out of education is in some ways very worrisome. When the OECD releases the PISA results, which measure, performance at end of high school, every government basically wants to know where they are. I remember, I think it was last year's results, and Japan had slipped a little bit. It was a cabinet issue. It was a national crisis. We are losing our space in global leadership. They want to know what Finland is doing so that they are always at the top plus Singapore. Lots of countries, particularly in OECD, are busy looking at what will our economy require in 2030. We have a vision 2030 right now. This was said by, this was a report that was commissioned by President Obama when he came in. And basically what this team is saying is, if we continue on our current course and the number of nations outpacing us, Singapore, Finland, and so on, outpacing us, in the education race continues to grow, the American standard of living will steadily fall relative to those other nations that are doing a better job. If the gap gets to a certain stage, the world's investors will conclude that they can get a greater return to their funds elsewhere, and it will be almost impossible to reverse course. The core problem is that education and training systems were built for another era. We could be saying that in Kenya, couldn't we?
we need to put, that's why for me, the revision of the curricula and about this discussion with Dr. Matiang'i is so important. The timing is right. Our economy is growing. We have a government that really is doing a lot of things right. The revision of the curriculum should be centerpiece, but contextualized as they did in the US in 2009, I believe it was, to the economy and to the future. Because we are not going to sustain a double-digit growth as we aspire to do in Vision 2030 without the capabilities of our people. So the US the UK also has got a 50-year plan looking at the skills for the next 30 years and how the education systems needs to adjust. So bringing those two together becomes important. The challenge we have is what you precisely pointed out. Virtually everybody in this room is sending their kids to private schools. So when the results of KCSE come out, I don't know how many of you even read the newspaper because it doesn't touch you. As opposed to Japan or US or whoever who basically turned this into a national crisis. So whether the kids are going to private school or not, we need to realize that we are, as a country, we are as strong as the weakest among us. So if there is poor performance in our public schools, whether we are directly involved or not, unless we help to improve it, these are the ones who are going to increase insecurity later on because they don't have jobs and so on and so forth. So we need to have a self-interest in what happens there. As for government research agenda, Professor, we have it and we don't. It is not sort of specified in terms of themes and issues, but much more in terms of what we need to achieve, both in the Vision 2030, but also in the Jubilee Manifesto. We want to create employment for so many. I would like somebody to say, how many jobs have we created and why haven't you grown more jobs? We want to have universal education at primary and secondary. How feasible is that? How much will it cost? So the agenda is there. It could be better directed, and it's a conversation. When I talk about coordination, it's a conversation we need to have. And I know that the new team and the cabinet secretary, Sisiri Kariuki, and the PS for Gender, Zainab, are actually already beginning to work on these issues because it's much more focused. So let's rally around that and try to build it. Over to you now.
The disparities between urban and rural women has always been there. I think the difference is that women in the rural areas in our day actually said, we educated you to do A, B, C, D. If it's a constitution, you come and read it to us and interpret it for us, and then we'll let you know. And if you did that, you would get invaluable advice. And when you spoke wherever you were, you felt you were not alienating the rural populations. That consultation, especially because of the networks that Ruth talked about earlier, were very, very, very useful, very valuable in linking women in urban areas. You know, we were accused of holding all our meetings in hotels. Unfortunately, we can't go to Kamukunji and speak the language we are speaking. However, we can go to Kamukunji after this and explain some of the major decisions we have made. They tried to create a divide between the so-called elite and the rural woman. It refused to work. That propaganda refused to work because we were basically rural. We are not urban. We were not urban. But let me also plead guilty. I'm in the private sector in education. And we are looking very much at the so-called changes that are going to happen. And for us, the structure is immaterial. Ruth, thank you very much indeed. The structure is immaterial. It is the substance. It is the delivery mechanisms. And I wish you could be focusing a lot on our teacher training colleges. The private schools take their children from the Togoto and the Chagoria and all the teacher training colleges without any input anywhere. But what to invest in the teachers, defining the quality aspect of education. And let me tell you, bring that exam full of the quality ideas that we are going to feed into the new curriculum. The private schools will still thrive because they're still a step ahead. Unfortunately, it is the link between the private sector and the public sector that is going to drive this country very, very, very far. Because like Ruth has said, we have what it takes. We have both experiences, multiple experiences, but we are not utilizing them because we are busy alienating the so-called rich and the poor. Where we are in the other Springs, we work with Mokoro Kwajenga because they too have private schools, schools that are not government, schools that are not supported. What can we do with them? And they've started doing very well, doing better than some of the children in the public schools. You know that even that deprivation doesn't have to deny us the quality of education. It's not the bag you are carrying. It's not even the textbook.